Yeah, you think about it, it's every single day something new. It's such a fluid situation, and I believe business owners they have to follow what's going on every single day, and the rules that apply today don't necessarily apply tomorrow.
That's what makes this really difficult. It's like hitting a moving target. Again, professional consultation in my mind is the best thing. But if you can't afford that or you don't have that opportunity or access to that, you really got to stay on top of things. But you want to start thinking about doing things like limiting as much contact, if you will, with the public as possible.
Joining me now is criminal defense attorney and legal analyst Bob Bianchi. Bob, thank you so much for joining me.
Great being with you, Stephanie.
And for those of you watching, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, Bob, I would imagine that your phone is ringing off the hook. A lot of people probably asking you questions, especially when it comes to running a business and how to go about handling coronavirus. So there's a lot of uncharted territory. And I've heard from a lot of business owners, they're like, well, what do? We don't want to get sued. We can't force our employees to come to work. Those who are coming to work, we want to keep them safe. And also we want to make sure that we're doing it responsibly. And also we want to avoid future lawsuits.
Right, Stephanie. So, when I got out from being prosecutor, I started a business consulting group that dealt with workforce safety issues and COVID-19. A lot of the experts on my team are former medical people as well as chief law enforcement executives. So since the COVID-19 scenario, our phone really, it has been going off the hook. And that's a good thing in terms of the businesses that are being smart. Here's what we're telling people. Just because the government unloosens the spigot or opens it up completely or whatever it does, that's great, but don't think that that relieves you of liability. You have a responsibility, as you've indicated, to your customers, and of course you want to make sure your customers are safe because that's good for your brand, but also your employees and your staff. And each individual business is different. We got off the phone with probably 2 law firms, an accounting firm, and then a company today that was asking us, "Can you give us just the instructions on how to do it?" And I'm like, each one is individually different depending on your workspace, your customer flow, but there are some tricks and hacks, if you will, that you can at least move yourself to a place where you're being safer, because down the road, should an employee or a customer get sick, you want to have consulted professionals that gave you a specific plan, standard operating procedures, ways of enforcing those procedures to ensure there's compliance, very important piece of it all, so that you could say, we relied upon these professionals. We didn't just do anything and throw it up against the wall. And that to me will be the key as to whether there'll be a successful lawsuit or not down the road.
Yeah, you think about it, it's every single day something new. It's such a fluid situation, and I believe business owners they have to follow what's going on every single day, and the rules that apply today don't necessarily apply tomorrow.
That's what makes this really difficult. It's like hitting a moving target. Again, professional consultation in my mind is the best thing. But if you can't afford that or you don't have that opportunity or access to that, you really got to stay on top of things. But you want to start thinking about doing things like limiting as much contact, if you will, with the public as possible. So for the law firm clients and accounting clients, for example, we would say, if you can teleconference, if you can use Zoom, do what we're doing now, do that. Only reserve those instances of time where you have to come into contact with the public to a minimum. Now, these are for professional service firms. And when you do that, have certain areas that are designated. Don't use the whole office. Make sure there's social distancing. Make sure that you have a protocol for disinfecting and making sure that your employees are not in close proximity to one another and or the clients. And for retail establishments, it becomes even more difficult to make sure that you have all these interactions with people. But I think the retail establishments are a little better off right now because they see what the grocery stores are doing in places like that where you have a lot of interaction. So there's a little bit more of a model for them as opposed to the smaller businesses.
Yeah, and that's really tough because you're talking about, especially in the workplaces right now, essential businesses where people have to try to stay away, social distance as much as possible, if you will. But is that even enough? Let's say they are following the rules and it's, people need to stay 6 feet or 13 feet apart. But how do we know that's even enough? I mean, somebody could still come back later with a claim and say, even though we were 13 feet apart, I got sick.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of this comes down to some other, things that people are going to think right now may sound somewhat draconian, and it's up to each business as to what level of responsibility it wants to accept. I would know personally, when I was working as prosecutor, I was working with a huge staff of lawyers and detectives and the public. So things like temperature testing, things like making sure that each employee every week certifies as to whether or not they have a fever or they're sick or anyone that they know that's contracted the illness. There's these protocols and procedures procedures that you could try to put in place. Of course, we'd love to have more testing, but that testing is kind of limited too, because the really vexing thing with this, Stephanie, as you know, is that people can be carriers of this and not even really exhibit symptoms, or they can be carriers of it for up to 12 to 14 days while it's incubating, shedding that disease onto other people. So it's going to take a multi-layered approach, but you do the best that you can under the circumstances to get the advice in each industry is to ensure that you look, no store wants it to, when we open up the spigot, wants it to be known that their store became an epicenter for coronavirus, because that is going to actually drive customers away. So it's important for the companies and the businesses to recognize that this goes to the bottom line too. And if I'm going into a place, at least I'm talking about Bob Bianchi, if I'm going into a place now, as I was weeks ago, where workers are without masks and without gloves, which I couldn't believe was occurring even in the food industry.
Yeah, so I turn grocery stores. I see it every single time I go.
It was unbelievable. I actually was in a situation where, I was going to get some, I wasn't even sure if I was going to eat pizza, but my wife wanted some pizza. We went to a grocery store, have a little pizza thing, and there's the guy standing there with gloves on, but he's got no mask, and he's standing literally right over the pizza. And I said to her, I'm not getting that for you, because I don't know if this guy's sick, if he's ill. Notice one of the companies, Papa John's, and I think that there's a new company, I think another one of the pizza companies came out. Very smart advertising when they say, we have your with degrees, 140-degree oven, and no human hands touch it from the minute it comes out of the oven till it gets into the box and gets to you. That's the kind of thing that's going to bring customer assurances, customer comfort, and I bet you they're going to get a big bump for being smart enough to recognize that message, because people will still fear going out irrespective of what the government allows or doesn't.
Well, and you also brought up the testing part, which was interesting, because listening to one of the coronavirus task force press briefings, we were learning that, yeah, testing is great, but just because you got tested today, get your results later, doesn't mean that you're not coronavirus positive the next day. So it's going to be really hard to track. Yeah, I can give you a general idea, but it's going to be hard to track. And I think as businesses begin to reopen, that's going to be a challenge that they're going to face. And you were talking about every business is going to have different ways to operate, but we're going to see a lot of businesses reopening. And I think it's pretty hard to deny that more people are going to get sick, right?
I think that that's just a fact, but you don't only have to be responsible, and businesses have to be responsible for the protection of people, but people have to be responsible for the protection of themselves. So if you go into an establishment like I did and you see a practice that you think is unsavory or dangerous, you need to turn around and walk away, not put yourself in that environment. I'm not putting the blame on the customer. I'm just talking about a reality.
Yeah.
I have a father who's elderly. He's still practicing law at 87 years old, or I don't want to. He can't be out there in the world doing stuff like that. And so I want to make sure that I'm practicing safe things so I don't get it and give it to somebody else. So we have to be vigilant. And, me and you have touched upon this issue before, Stephanie. It's time to bend the curve on blaming everything or requiring everyone else to do the work for you. You've got to do things to take care of your own personal protection as well. And I think that if you see a location or you see a store, I talk about wearing masks and gloves and you yourself doing those things, or if they're not practicing safe social distancing, all you're doing by engaging yourself in that environment is increasing that very risk that you identify. It is no doubt it's going to expand as people interact more with one another until we can get a vaccine.
Yeah, and I saw some lawsuits popping up. I was reading some of the big ones today. So, New York Nurses Association to sue over lack of protective gear and first legal action of its kind in an outbreak. Obviously, nurses need protection. They need masks. They need gloves. They need everything. They need everything of that sort to keep us safe, to keep themselves safe, to keep their families safe, and also to help prevent the spread of the virus. It's really unconscionable that they don't have the mask. It's hard to believe that there isn't even a lawsuit over this. Do you think that this is going to go anywhere legally?
It's a really great question, and this is what gets lawyers, if you love the law, you get excited about these kind of things, and here's the reason. I mean, if the hospitals in this particular instance, where they know frontline workers are going to be confronting this illness, don't provide the necessary, appropriate PPE, protective equipment for those people, then they are subject to liability. But we also have to look at the other side of the equation. If I were arguing on behalf of the hospital, I'd say we don't have the equipment. We still have to service patients. We just can't walk out of the hospitals. We have done, and this is why it's important, again, getting back to that consulting piece, everything we can humanly in order to get this PPE, and then even if we didn't have it, to come up with hacks and alternatives to at least minimize the risk. And if they do those things, then that lawsuit becomes a little less good, if you will, for the nurses. But what I have seen and I have personal experience with, which I gotta be honest with you, agitates me. I have a very dear loved one that is in the medical field, and I mean a very close to me person. And it wasn't until even 2 weeks ago they were even being given masks under the guise of, and I've read this, Stephanie, in a lot of places, and this is bad practices. Oh, they don't want to scare the patients. Well, number one, you have a health obligation to the patients. Number two, I think the patients will be fine with the idea that you're practicing safe COVID-19 practices. And thirdly, the idea that you would expose those workers, and to the point now where now they've been generous enough to give one mask per week, to these individuals. Now, if they don't have it and they're doing everything they can, that's one story. But unfortunately, I think some administrators have made decisions that they don't want to scare people and they don't want to go through the expense or risk the expense. That's an issue. My last point, I'm sorry to go off on this because I love the subject.
Go ahead.
My last point on this is that we are in an environment, and I am dealing with this from the consulting group side, where the states are all vying for equipment. Some states need it more than others. That, because it's not a uniform approach, is causing some price gouging and things of that nature, and some shortage supplies in places where it's needed more than less. And the other thing is that the private is very important. The private sector is going out and trying to get this equipment too. Unfortunately, when they get the equipment, some of them are being defrauded, some of them are being scammed. Much of it comes from China, and even the good stuff that they get is subject to seizure by FEMA. So they're now getting uncomfortable that, why am I going to invest money in doing this? So the supply chains are becoming a real problem with this in my mind. I know the federal government's trying to wrap its arms around it and kind of have a command center. And understandably, this is something unique and novel, and we never anticipated. But supply issues are a problem, are an issue.
And I don't know if you saw this one, but this is pretty interesting. Walmart is being sued in Illinois in an Illinois court over employees' COVID-19 death.
Yeah, well, let's go to the basics of what a lawsuit is in these instances. First of all, it's a wrongful death suit. There has to be some level of negligence. Negligence means a deviation from a reasonable standard of care that's owed from, in this particular case, Walmart and its employee. So the question becomes, given the circumstances that applied here, given what Walmart did, we're back in the same equation, or what they didn't do, was their actions or a violation of a reasonable duty for standard of care. Under the law, you're not entitled to the best standards. You're not entitled to the absolute awesomeness of things. All businesses and people have to do in order not to be sued or successfully sued is have a reasonableness standard. What would the reasonable, ordinary, prudent person in the industry at that time, based on the information they have, do? And it really those cases just come down to what are the facts. And the last part is, can you prove that they got the virus there as opposed to somewhere else?
Yeah, that would be probably pretty tough to prove, because you could literally pick it up anywhere. And it brings me to another question. Right now, the essential businesses that are open, for the most part, they're allowing employees to decide if they want to work. So would that play a role in how this lawsuit would go?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, giving an option allows people to make a decision, like we talked about before, and take the personal responsibility as to whether they will or will not go. Now, as we all know, people that are working in essential services like grocery stores and Walmarts and places like this, many people in America are a paycheck away from a disaster. So there are some realities. You have kids, you have family. Some people are going to be forced to work, but giving the option is going to be something that's going to be favorable to the business in terms of a lawsuit down the road.
What about Delta? So coronavirus cancellations, says Delta responds to class action lawsuit over ticket refunds. So they were saying that it was almost impossible to get a hold of Delta employees to get a refund. And so now a lot of people are piling in on this.
Yeah, that's a little bit more of now we went from negligence law, right, to contract law. This is how lawyers analyze cases. So what area of law are we in is a huge thing. Every bar wants to make sure, bar exam wants to make sure the lawyer can identify the legal issue that's involved. And some of these tickets have things like disclaimers on them, and in certain instances, the airlines have a right to be able to deny service for certain reasons, and there may have been very appropriate here. I think most people are going to say that given what was developing, as you indicated before, and unfolding at certain points in time for safety purposes, they declined these flights, because now the reverse happens. If they allowed people to be packed into a plane and they got sick, then they're going to be sued for that. So were they reasonable in that? And as far as the contract is concerned, there may need to be a congressional fix here, in my mind, that they're going to have to sit there and say, even if these people who had the tickets are not allowed to file a lawsuit and be successful because of the disclaimer on the tickets, whether or not we're going to step in to make it right here. Well, we'll have to wait and see what the legislature does with this. But as far as a lawsuit is concerned, I think the airlines are going to be on pretty good grounds with this.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking Delta or any airline couldn't be prepared to have the thousands or hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of calls to reschedule flights, cancel flights. They probably just didn't have the infrastructure for that. I don't think any airline could possibly prepare for a disaster like this.
Yeah, that's why in contracts they have a thing called force majeure, or there's language that basically says force of nature or acts of God, other people call them, that there are certain limitations that they know to put in there or that exist, so that if something happens and for the health, safety, and welfare of its passengers, it takes actions that somehow are egregious to them economically, they're allowed to take them for the betterment of health and life. Same kind of principle that occurs with regard to government. We talked about this, I think, the last time, where we have tremendous civil rights, and people are upset that government has the ability to curb those rights. But there is clearly in the law the ability of government for the health, safety, and welfare of its people. And I know that that's a phrase that people, I mean, obviously you see throughout the country, people do see it differently, can take. It's rationally related to the governmental purpose, and so long as it lasts, only as long as that danger exists, and then they got to revert back to loosening the restrictions and giving more civil rights to its citizens. Fascinating, Stephanie, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one that caught my eye was lawmakers have introduced a bill that would let Americans sue China over the Wuhan virus.
Really, really complex, heady law here. So obviously we understand why those lawmakers are putting that law in there. There is a significant amount of evidence. I don't know what side of the equation people are. I don't know what the truth is or what the facts ultimately are going to be fleshed out, but that the Chinese government knew about this, that the Chinese government hid it from people. Even though President Trump stopped the flights from China coming in here, there was a whole period of time that people were coming from China and coming in, especially to the city, into New York City in particular, and we were completely unaware that this was a problematic issue. The problem, though, is that suing a foreign nation state, there are laws and treaties that make it very, very limited as to when you can do that. One of the last ones you saw was the passage of the terrorism scenario from 9/11, where there was the allowance, if you were considered deemed by the State Department to be a terrorist organization or a terrorist nation, that you would be able to file a suit under that Sovereign Immunity Act. And the question will be whether or not this fits within one of the exceptions that typically says you can't do that unless. We'll see if this fits.
And I know that a lot of people want to hold China accountable for what's happened. As you mentioned, we still don't know exactly where the virus came from, how or why, but we did learn that China wasn't transparent. China knew about the virus way before they told the US. And so had they taken different action, a lot of lives could have been saved in this country, is the argument that has been made.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, that even I believe, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but the doctor in China who was the quote unquote whistleblower, who wound up ironically dying of the disease itself, was being withheld. And anyone from the Chinese government that was expressing concern over the virus, as at least as we understand it, based on the news that we're getting here, was quelled in the beginning of this because they were trying to keep it under wraps. But look, if you can get past the jurisdictional issue, and what I mean by that is if the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act is allowed to allow you to sue them, and you can develop that they were aware and they knew and that they should have been producing that to the communities at large, including the United States and other foreign nations, it certainly would be an excellent lawsuit. It's our world and the rest of the world, Italy, and other places have been completely devastated. And Stephanie, make no mistake about it, and we say this in the consulting group all the time, the world as we know it will not go back to normal after this. It's not just the lives lost, which is horrible, horrible, horrible. The economic devastation that's going to occur, the infrastructure devastation that's going to occur, and even when we open back up, the continued growth of this until we have an immunity response to it, as well as how we're going to conduct business, is going to have calamitous effects on the country. Although I'm positive Americans, and I mean this sincerely, will always find a way to find opportunity, find ways to take care of themselves, and overcome. But in the meantime, loss across the board.